How is everyone doing? I guess I want to say today RIP to David Graeber, who died in Venice, I guess. Jesus, people are dropping, man. And it's a lot of good people, and of course, none of the bad. And I just want to say that, like, I didn't really know him. I never really interacted with him. I know he had a prickly reputation online and being a guy who argued a lot, and of course, I didn't agree with him on everything because he's an anarchist. But I did read Debt, and I thought Debt was, in aggregate, great. You can quibble all you want with some of the historical stuff, but because he's not a historian, he's an anthropologist. But the anthropological work is really, really important because I think the central element of Debt that I carry with me the most is his annihilation of the presiding myth of the rise of currency, of money, the rise of like denominated debt into society, and the Adam Smith neoliberal standard model that we all absorb at the level of our fucking DNA by the time we're two, says that arose because you had a situation where once societies got bigger, once social orders became larger, you had a situation where some people had stuff that other people needed, had more stuff than they needed, and there were other people who had stuff that they needed. Was it coinciding deficiencies or something? I don't remember. But it was a way to represent exchange that had previously been barter, because that's how you do it if you have like a low-level social complication. Is I have 5 chickens, that equals 3 goats or something. And that money came to represent that exchange. And I think Graeber pretty ably dismantles that and says that's a fiction. That is a story that they tell themselves. I mean, it's as much a fiction as like the Garden of Eden. It's like a parable that they made up to justify their ideology. Their like religious faith, which is capitalism. Capitalism is in their minds where religion is, had been in previous generations, and it is in most of ours. We've replaced God with capital in one way or another, and that's what they worship. And the story, the Adam and Eve story of that faith is, I got all these chickens but no goats, and I got all these goats but no chickens. It's not true at all. Graeber points out, pretty ably shows that in tribal social orders, if there is a incongruity of resources, like somebody has stuff that other people don't, they don't need a neutral medium of exchange, or even an exchange of any kind. There is a social obligation understanding that is beyond the level of the transaction, that is beyond the level of individual acts, because labor hasn't been alienated. Labor is done for oneself and for others in equal amount, which means there's no alienation. Alienation is when you are doing less for you and more for someone else, and it's usually owners or slave drivers or someone other than you. That's when people become separate from one another. That's when social obligations dissolve in the face of pain, in the face of the desire for people to gain some sort of opiate, some sort of salve for the wounds of having their labor alienated. And that's where you need to have a market transaction to exchange, because what's in it for me becomes the only question. And so you have to have a neutral exchange. You can't have barter. You go straight to representation, because representation is all we have. We have to representation, a social obligation that's been lost because of alienation. If you don't have that alienation, that social alienation, resource distribution is handled by ritualized, a almost biologically frictionless act of equalization. The way that like a cell will equalize across its own membranes in order to maintain integrity. And like the actual ritual mechanisms of those are different from society to society, but a lot of them are represented by things like the potlatch, which is the origin of our concept of a potluck, which is a ritual of the distribution and annihilation of surplus, so that it doesn't build up, because it can only build up if it's not being evenly distributed. And so all this stuff, the Homo economicus view of humans as rational economic seekers, That's all. That is a myth. That's a religious tradition, and it has a founding mythology. It has its own Olympian tales and epic sagas, and birthing scenes and primal scenes. And one of them is that first time that somebody needed to give a goat for a chicken. But if they knew each other, why would they have to have that exchange? One thing that Graeber points out really eloquently is that in traditional societies, it's actually rude to repay someone's debt entirely. Every exchange should leave a little remainder, because that implies that there will be a continuing obligation between you. Paying off a debt is closing that door and saying, you are a stranger to me. And how could we have started like that? How could any civilization have existed for any viable amount of time if we really started off treating each other that way? It's impossible. The only thing you can argue is that the only way to create the complex nodes that allow us to have a technological society that allow us to do things like have language, or dang iPhones, or longer lifespans that are less animalistic, that allow us to develop culture, to allow us to create things that give us the chance to reflect on ourselves and make ourselves aware of our moment and our place in time and space and our relationship to other people in a way that we can't do even within the tribal society, because then there is an outside to fear always. Can we not find that? And they say we get that way by having a market, by the engine of capitalism. And that's what builds this. And that's what we get to live in. No, that's not true at all. Capitalism is the last manifestation of different regimes of resource extraction that come about because you have this undistributed sense of social solidarity. People don't see other people as themselves. So they have to find out what to think they are. And that can only be achieved through continued conflict, by continued interaction, and by continued domination of one over the other. Because if they are not you, you can do what you want to them, if you want it bad enough. And people wanted things like the pyramids bad enough, and they wanted southern cotton to be a profitable world market commodity enough. The English wanted tea enough from the Indians. And so they build this market to satisfy. And that's the last representation. You have to build a market after you've destroyed social bonds through exploitation. If you can't exploit people anymore, if the religious world that you have been able to exploit from the top to maintain social cohesion and social accedance to power, if that wears away, which it will over time as social bonds are slowly and steadily and always pushed away from one another by accumulated trauma of class conflict, you will eventually snap the social bonds entirely, and you have to replace them with something, and you replace them with the liberal sense of self. We are individuals, we are equal, which means we can't just dominate and take from each other. We have to negotiate across that equal plane, but we are different and distinct and separate and always will be. And so the only way that we can organize a social intercourse is through a neutral medium of exchange. And that's true if you think that is immutable, if you think that's the only way we can relate to one another. And I don't think so. I think there's another turn of the screw. I think there's a turn of the screw where we are able to master enough the technology that we have at our disposal to connect, and we utilize that to bring about through time. It wouldn't be easy. It would be, none of us will see it. No one's children will see it. It might not be us. It might be fucking cephalopods. But there will be a big enough movement of working class people whose experience of exploitation has bent them towards the same vision of justice, broadly enough to allow them to continue to fight on the same side. And in so doing, overthrow the regime of exploitation, the world system that is currently controlled by the ruling class. And I know that these are all slippery terms, and that in the heat of the battle they will break one way or the other, but that's what history is for, to grind that fucking pestle into that mortar. And we see the results, the kernels spilling forth. And I think that through that process we can gain social awareness that is as powerful a self-regulator of behavior as tribal intimacy, but in a context of total technological control of nature. meaning that we would no longer destroy and defile nature. We would enter self-aware homeostasis with nature. And then the work of history, the real work of history, could begin. The work of the human race as a consciousness could begin. People have dinged me for saying that the dialect ends with the end of capitalism. If I said that, I'm wrong. I didn't mean that. What I meant is that the process of class conflict resolves. And that level of dialectical exchange is abolished over time. But that doesn't mean the dialectic ends. That's how we are going to figure out what to do once we realize we're a social organ, and we have the ability to communicate across the whole of the planet through the technology that we've accrued, and we were able to distribute the labor inputs necessary to maintain the system as evenly as possible, so they fall as lightly on the shoulders of as many as possible. Then we will have to manage this system, this steady state system, and extend and create things to do with it. What are we going to do with these powers? But that process will also be a dialectical resolution. It will just not be through conflict. It will not be through social violence, because it will be one organism. But it's still a dialectical process, and that's when we begin to make history. We are able to make history, and the only way a human really could, as part of one species, because individually we fight against one another. We clam and bat, and so much of our potential is wasted and annihilated in these matter-antimatter conflicts, because we do not see the whole for the sum of its parts. Whew. Did that make sense? I'm sorry, Marx knows more than Nathan Robinson, because Marx's understanding of the dialect goes deeper than his does. His understanding of material reality, observed from empirical observation, and his intellect and his empathy combining, have rendered him more an accurate viewer of how the world is. And so if people listen to Nathan Robinson instead of Karl Marx, it's gonna be harder for them to get the right conclusions, because they're gonna start from the wrong premises. And so I felt like I had to say something, but I just said it in a snarky way. And I'm sorry to Nathan, honestly, for insulting him. It's like, I'm not going to do that anymore, because it doesn't do anything. Because all it did was, it told everybody who likes Nathan Robinson, and like, they've invested liking Nathan Robinson as part of what makes them a good person and a good leftist, and therefore a good person. And so to attack that is to attack their sense of being. Of course they're going to fight back. And it's never going to be about the actual terrain of the argument. They're defending a key component of their identity. How is that ever going to be able to be talked about rationally? Especially when you're talking about an online space where neither one of us can guarantee the good faith of the other. And it just exploded, and I realized, oh, I have made things worse. Him just saying that would have been X amount of unhelpful, but me pointing it out has actually reified this anti-dialect and made things worse in the long run. Like, I've actually affected the world for the worse. I lost Good Place points, if anyone's seen that show. And I'm like, damn, I can't do that anymore. Shit. So I've been trying since then, before now, to answer people who've responded to me in some of the comments with as open a heart as possible, to try to get at what I was trying to say. And just, if I feel like I can answer a question confidently, if I feel like I can, I have enough of an understanding of like how this fits into my overall view of the world, then I can say I'll answer. And I have been, and it's been a good exercise. It's making me like feel more confident in myself. And the thing is, the more confident you are in your beliefs, the less emotional you are about them, the better you are about arguing at them. So much of like the deplatforming mania that's on both sides of politics is essentially people reifying their insecurity in their beliefs. Like they cannot comprehend. They can't. The idea of debating or engaging with another idea is anathema, because their belief is brittle enough, and they fear that there is someone who understands things more than them and could make them not believe what they believe anymore. But those beliefs are so deeply tied to their sense of identity that is terrifying and threatening. But the thing is, one group is right and one group is wrong. You don't have to just say both sides. No, one side's right, the other side is wrong. But the side that's right in this case might not be right enough to recognize how right they are, and therefore doesn't have the confidence and emotional endurance to really think through everything they believe. So, anyway. So I said what I said, and I've kind of boiled it down to a little drawing I want to put here. So this is me trying to divorce my critique of Nathan Robinson's dismissal of Marx without any personal invective and without any slant towards the wretched ad hominem or anything else. This is purely trying to contextualize the dispute, and I'm going to use a piece of paper here to try to get it across, because I will not, like I said, I really don't want to look like a crazy person. And I know putting out a graph doesn't necessarily help you relieve your mind on that case, but I'm just going to see if it's helpful for me. So we've got two firmaments here. This is broad, and these categories suppress other categories that are more complicated, but they're not necessary. You guys can see this, all right? So here's the world as it is. This is the world we live in. It sucks. We hate it. We recognize that it's bad because we're alienated from our time and our labor. That makes things shitty. That makes us want to die, but also afraid of dying. You got up here, socialism, let's say, broadly construed, because we're trying to do big tent. We're going to take on good faith everybody's claim that they are a socialist when they say they are. So Nathan Robinson, I believe he's a socialist, okay? Because he wants this. I believe, because how will I ever prove he isn't to anyone's satisfaction? It'd be impossible. You're asking me to, like, dissect his soul. All we can say is, does he act as though he wants socialism? And it seems as though he does. But he lives down here. We all live down here, and we all have to build a bridge. First through thought, then through action, praxis, that is then collectively endeavored towards the goal. If you get enough people pushing in the same direction, you can get here. But they all have to be doing it together. That's cooperation, that's socialism, that's communism, that's everything. Okay? So the thing is, how do you get it? What's the engine? What's the thought engine that drives this from is to should be? Okay? I would say that Marx, because he emerged at the moment that capitalism emerged. That's not a coincidence. He was historically contingent. Marx emerged when he did because he was seeing the beginning of capitalism. He grasped all of its contours, and so that is why his analysis of capitalism is the single most important one. It doesn't mean he was right about everything. It doesn't even mean he was right on balance in some way, most things. It means he was right on the most basic things that you build from. Because you can say, well, Marx didn't anticipate ecology, and Marx didn't anticipate feminism, or Marx didn't anticipate racism. Marx didn't anticipate technological advancement. Marx didn't anticipate like how far imperialism would extend capitalism's ability to expand market and increase inputs. Yeah, because he died in 1881. He could only observe, he could create models and then observe them play out in reality only in front of him. We have to add on, but we add starting with the Marx. And what Nathan Robinson is saying essentially is replace Marx with me. Because if it's not Marx, then who is it? Well, the guy tells you to discard Marx, and you're starting from scratch and trying to figure out how to get from here to here. You have no roadmap. Who are you going to trust more than the guy that just told you to give away the foundational guy of the whole thing, the foundational set of ideas? And I'm saying that because Nathan Robinson exists so far away from the Big Bang of capitalism that he is such a liberal subject, as we all are. He is so suffused with the liberalism that is redounded through the cultural superstructure over the last 200 years that his insights will not go as deep as Marx's were, because he was there at the temporal beginning. He wasn't captured by the ideology of capitalism yet, because he hadn't grown up under it. Nathan Robinson is captured, as I am, as everyone reading this is, by the ideology of capitalism. So we all have to come together and take everything that came before us and everything that we see around us to build enough to counteract that ideology. And you start with something like Marx. You cannot start with nothing, because then you are in thin air. You are a late capitalist subject trying to bootstrap yourself into an observational point of view of capitalism that you cannot have because you're inside of it. It's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You are in capitalism. You're embedded in it. You cannot be outside of it to see where you are. But Marx could, because he didn't grow up under it. And that's why he is so disastrously wrong to say that we shouldn't have had Marx. Because that means that those things still would have come up. Those insights would still be there. People would still articulate them. But they would have articulated them later, which would have meant they would have articulated them with less specificity, and it would have been harder to build on them. It would be literally retarding progress, because it retards the dialectic. Because Marxism emerges to come into conflict with the reality of capitalism and create new realities. That's the dialectic of history. And it's like, I didn't get it for a long time. I assumed it was right because I agreed with other parts of Marx. I was like, I agree with all this stuff about Marx, about like class struggle. I see it's clearly true. I'm not so sure about the dialectic. So I will just say I agree with that part. Problem is, that means I don't really believe in Marxism that much, because I can't justify it beyond that level. And that leaves me vulnerable. That leaves me feeling insecure about it. And when you reach that point, there are two things to do. You can either say, well, Marx is wrong, or you can say, I am going to try to figure it out. Why do I believe this? Why? What principles does class struggle come from? And that's where you get to the basic stuff, like historical materialism, and then on top of that, dialectical materialism. Like first the observation of the material conditions, and then the notion that they are driven by conflict between ideas, which is then turned at the higher level into class struggle. There's class struggle. They're all built on top of one another. Now, we're stuck here because intervening technology, this is where Marx dies, basically. Marx dies here. Now we've got this time here. We have intervening time. We have new technology. We have empire. We have the world wars. We have all this stuff, but we still have to get there, and Marx can't help us anymore. So now what do? We build on top of this with other stuff. Stuff about ecology, stuff about race, stuff about gender, stuff about technology, stuff about computers, all that stuff. You add it on top. You add it on top of the base here. Now, what Nathan Robinson is doing by rejecting this stuff because he didn't understand it and didn't either have the patience or brains to study it until he did, rejects it and says, it must not be true because I don't understand it. No, you don't understand it. And to you, therefore, it isn't true. If you understood it, you could reject it and say, no, this entire premise is wrong, but it flows to every other principle you're talking about. It flows. The dialectic flows all the way up from the historical materialism to the dialectical materialism to the class struggle. It all flows up towards a state of actual existing socialism for all humankind. The actual end point of teleological Marxism. If you say no to that, what you're basing it on, like you're basically basing it on liberal concepts of morality. Now, if you're off here, if you're Nathan Robinson, you're going off. And you know where this is? You know what that arrow is up there? That arrow is liberal personal individualism. Because that's what like anarchism is, as Chomsky has admitted. anarchist traditions and things of that nature exist to try to get to socialism, without a basis of materialism. And what they do instead is they say, well, we are morally required to create a just society because we all are individual beings with individual rights. But that creates, the only way to adjudicate the idea of us all being monads like that is through market transactions, which necessitates capitalism. So it creates liberal subjects. And now liberal subjects, if they're given enough time and resources, might get to socialism, but given the constraints of resources on a planet over time, that will likely lead to destruction before it gets to socialism. Which we're going to have to do. At some point, we're all going to have to, if the left coalesces into anything meaningful in this country, at some point, we are all going to have to submit in that we are going to have to give up some control over our lives, some control over what we do, some control over when we do it, some control over ourselves to someone else in the form of a organization that will have central discipline. Because that's the only way you get to do, you can apply force is through coordination. Otherwise, it's just undirected force is destroyed in piecemeal. One of the most moving scenes in cinema history, in my opinion. It's when, towards the end, when Dory and Albert Brooks are swimming in a big sea of dumbass fish that are just all going lip, 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 and they get caught in a fucking, one of those big old industrial fishing nets. And they're getting pulled up, and they're all gonna get, oh God, we're gonna get turned into fish sticks. And all the fish are swimming crazily, wildly against the net, but by their own instinct. And then Dory and Albert Brooks get them to stop freaking out, and they go in one direction. They all swim down at in this point in the same way, and the fucking net breaks off of the fucking rope. That is the labor movement. That is the left. That's the modern left. And when it succeeds anyway, and that's the goal, that's the entire thing. Finding Nemo, whatever. If you're not pushing in the same direction, it's just gonna get, it's just, your individual effort will eventually be diffused. And so with language you have religion. Because don't do something, why not? Well, because I'm like you, and you see, if both of us are afraid of the other one, then neither of us will be able to sleep in front of the fire. You can't tell someone that. You don't have the capacity. And more importantly, you don't have the ability to know that he'll believe you. Because it's just really an intellectual argument. And like I said, these concepts aren't really extant yet. What you say is, it will anger a greater power than either of us. And if you act well, that power will do you well. And since you live in a terrifying wilderness, that when you're totally at the whim of seasons and storms and sun and moon and rain, when these things determine your life, of course you're going to just logically think anyway that this stuff is in charge. You tie that to behavior. That's what the symbolic order does. And so the first consciousness, that's the first leap a human has to make to resolve the contradiction of being one consciousness in a universe of consciousnesses and a universe period. One finite point in an infinite expanse. We have to resolve that. The first resolution is, okay, I am whatever, I am a thing, a self. These people are not self, but they are close enough to self that I trust them. But that means that you're going to be fighting other people because there's other people out there. They have different symbols. They use different things. Uh-oh, it's time for a rumble. And eventually, once this pressure leads to, hey, maybe we could get an edge with some agriculture, you find some fucking wild corn or something, and you've created settled societies. That work has to be distributed. And how will it be distributed? Well, now whoever is most adept at manipulating the symbolic order can basically determine who does the work. And who the hell would decide to do as much work as the other people? I'm over here thinking this shit up. Why the fuck should I be in the goddamn rows with you losers? Especially if my ability to manipulate the symbolic order gets bigger, stronger guys to listen to me. All of a sudden, boom, you've gone from a priesthood to a kingship. And you've created a new social order that is predicated not on conflict between tribes, but conflict within tribes, among those who work and those who take, among who gets the surplus. Because now it is being unevenly distributed, which it had not been before. And that process creates contradictions that have to be resolved. And that is the litany that Marx talks about, from the slave society where, hey, all social contradictions can be resolved by conquering other people, enslaving them, and making them work. Great, now we don't have social contradictions. This is awesome. As long as there's an other to enslave and others to take stuff from, we can keep a social order and argue within it and create a political class and create abstract notions, all of which create this hegemonic superstructure of religion and civic understandings and personal conceptions of the self, all in alignment to maintain this system because we can outload it. Well, that system breaks down. Shit. Well, now we've lost the tech, and the thing that drives all of this is technology. The thing that drives this, the material lever, the Archimedean plane that's jacking this thing up, is technology. And technology will, over time, even though it's not a fixed rate, it will accrue. And as it accrues, it intensifies the ability to extract surplus and the complexity of the social mechanisms necessary to manipulate those tools in order to extract surplus. And that creates new social forms that become incompatible with the order that had previously existed. And that creates new social lines that create new classes that must then be resolved. And through this process, we got to a point where there were so many people that you could be theoretically aware of. And they had so much organization themselves that conquest is no longer the way you can deal with things, because you will destroy each other. So you have to accommodate others. Fuck, how do you accommodate someone? This is the end of my fucking web of empathy. It ends at whatever the hell social form I have. But our complex economy now requires us to trade, because everybody is geographically bound, and that means that they're bound by the resources in their geographic area. Shit, they gotta trade them. How are we gonna trade them? Fuck. Shit. And that means we gotta trade them within our society, which had been like refounded on like the feudal order, which is just sort of like reasserting like a tribal familiarity, but hierarchically arranged in order to generate surplus, which means that even though it's stable, over time it becomes unstable because it's generating conflict. And that creates the liberal self, in which, oh, there is something called a human race, and we are all at a metaphysical level equal. And that's where we've been. And that's the conception of self under capitalism. That was the big inflection point, away from abstract grouping around symbols, which was away from tribal connection to like people actually in your vicinity. But now we're at the end of capitalism, one way or the other. And that's why I look at that trajectory, and I look at our trajectory, and I say, even if it's not likely that we're going to get to socialism, it is the only sane and moral pursuit, because it assumes that there will be another inflection point when the complexity of our networks of technology and our interconnectivity and our awareness of our interconnectivity as humans and our ability, and this is the hard part, this is the real fucking pull, of distributing pain more evenly, which we have not done well. And that's one of the reasons we're at a crisis point, and it looks like we might break towards barbarism. If we can write this and change that flow and distribute some goddamn pain, we could get to the final inflection point where we recognize, oh, no. It's not there are other people that are metaphysically the same as me, but different from me, which is the liberal self, different from me, therefore with distinct motives, at best ends, earnest desire, like that there's a conflict, that there's inherent conflict, and that's the liberal self. And that's why liberalism and capitalism are inextricably linked from that perspective. Because if that's the case, if everybody is separate and unknowable, is a black box, like we are to them, then we can only exchange across an agreed upon platform, a market, where we use things like money to stand in for value and exchange value. Because how else are we supposed to deal across that void? The final, and it is the final one, because this is like the teleological endpoint. The final one is a recognition. Oh, fuck. No, there's no distinction. It's all in my head. And I'm not going to ever be able to get rid of it. But if I'm aware of that, it means that I cannot privilege my own advancement, which means that I can't fucking hoard surplus. I can't make others work for my fucking bread. I can't do it. It's a crime. And if you have enough people, like I'm saying, is you have people with these understandings all through history. It's a question of getting enough people, getting to that inflection point of numbers within the subset of human beings. And then you can coordinate at will. You don't have, distrust is not threaded through because alienation isn't threaded through. And that flow that I talked about, that capitalism necessitates, that global flow, that I would say the global flow, like people who hate the idea of globalism because they hate neoliberalism, they're missing the forest for the trees. That flow is necessary. How the hell else do you have like a planet with a planet's worth of resources and a planet's worth of people distribute? They have to be distributed across the entire globe. But the thing is, that's far in the future. You know, you can't get fixated on that. I'm just saying that's the end point. And you need an inflection point, and that happens because you leaven pain with ease and technological advancement, which intensifies our awareness of other people. Like the invention of the novel, people say that the novel is a reactionary, inherently reactionary form. And I would say now it is. The novel is a reactionary form now in the sense that it reifies that sense of people being separate from each other, and it reifies a ton of just like bourgeois expectations within it. But at the time that the novel arose, it was incredibly progressive because the novel told people, those other people, in their head, it's the same shit, man. Your head and their head have the same things in them, the same desires. They don't have them. They're not different. And when you have that realization, you can't treat them. Now, that doesn't mean that you immediately, we're all going to do, everything's going to be great because there's still exploitation, which means we might have a metaphysical understanding of ourselves as equal, but then there's the profit motive. And that's where slavery and things happen. Slavery happens because it's like, man, we got a lot of land to clear here. And the only way that we can make this make money is if we just exploit the shit out of people's labor. Like we have to leave them with nothing because the amount of money you would have to pay someone to do plantation agriculture, specifically shit like sugar, by the way, sugar plantation was one of the worst places you could appear in human history. Like the fucking Roman silver mines and fucking sugar plantation agriculture. But it's not like fucking indigo and tobacco and cotton were fucking walk in the park. The amount of money you'd have to pay someone to do that would wipe out profit. So so you can't pay them low amounts of money because they would say no. They have to be bonded. And how are you going to bond someone with a liberal conception of the self and a liberal conception of others? Well, yes, metaphysically the same, but not really. Look at that kid. And skin color is the first one. And then from that you build a whole world. Well, you know, they don't think things as deeply as us. They don't have the feelings. They're ruled by animal passions, and you know, they're at some point they'll get. And that's the thing. Like now we're at an end point of annihilation. Like now our Nazis, our fascists are all, I would say, because they're bending away from liberalism back towards a feudal conception, and they're like, they're faced with the crisis we're in, and they say, because I'm going to focus on the self, and I'm going to fixate and reify the self only. And since that means that is incompatible with liberalism, because liberalism is breaking down, because capitalism is breaking down, and it can't be sustained anymore, I'm going to go with tribalism. Neo-feudalism? Sure, I'll take neo-tribalism. And you'll just be reinforcing the destruction, everything, and because everything that made you that pissed off and alienated and miserable is what's going to be intensified under neo-feudalism. But so now they're all eliminationists because they're all, yeah, no, these guys just have to go because they aren't the same as us, because we have science to prove they're not the same as us. Antebellum slave owners mostly didn't talk that way. They generally said, like, slavery is instruction. And one of the ways you know that they didn't think that is because they had sex with slaves all the time. They raped slaves. And it was socially acceptable, too. Richard Mentor Johnson, who was, I've talked about him, he was the vice president under Van Buren. He caused a scandal by marrying, basically, as like a common law, I think, a slave and having kids by her. She was his, like, sort of second lady unofficially. And that was a huge scandal. He had to drop out, or he had to leave office. He wouldn't have been able to go to Washington with, like, a horse that he fucking married. You know? Like, people fuck animals sometimes, but it is wildly frowned upon, which was not the case in the antebellum South. There was a lot of sex, of slave rape. There's a ton of slave rape, which means it was socially accepted within certain circles, which means they knew they were fucking human beings. They defined them out of humanity so that they could extract massive profits. The only way you were going to clear that land and make it profitable. And then people can point out, as they like to do, yeah, but slavery eventually became unprofitable. It's like, yeah, but at that point it had created a fucking entire social order that didn't know that or care about that. It wanted to maintain itself. It could only be destroyed from outside or from an internal contradictions erupting, which could have happened. Slave rebellion was inevitable. Slave rebellion was inevitable in the South. If you want to talk about how if they'd won the Civil War, the slave uprising was not in any way out of the question. Especially when you consider how the course of the war loosened slavery to the point where if they could have gotten it back in the bottle, it would have been, that jar would have been tough to fucking put up. The idea of the libertarian subject is psychotic. Like, I honestly believe this. I feel like if there is some governing intelligence that Chomsky likes to talk about, some extraterrestrial intelligence or some greater just watcher, like objective observer who could look at human civilization, look at human thought, they would identify post-war American libertarianism as a mental illness. I know that's a joke because Michael Savage likes to say liberalism is a mental disorder, but I honestly think that the libertarian theory of personhood is actually psychotic, because it requires a psychotic a renunciation of the physical world, right? Like, that's how we define psychotics, is that the world they're living in is one that we watch or look around us and know is not consonant with the one we're all seeing collectively. That's why we decide that's the psycho. That's who they are. They were it, but because they had the money, they could actually enforce it on the rest of us. Because they had the capital, they could actually, like, make this meaningful. But, like, in absence of an architecture of capital to back it up, it's telling people, hey, you know how you were born into absolute, vulnerability without language, consciousness, understanding of yourself, anything. The world around you, the people who bring you, you exist because two people decided to have you. You were pulled from someone. You were nurtured in someone, pulled from someone, raised from a point where, because, like, all right, I had you. My responsibility to you is over. All right, well, you're going to die. 100% of people will die at that point. The reason they don't die is because we all graze each other. That's why we can even think, because we have a language we inherit from each other. It's like there's no individual, there's no moment where I can stop this process and say, yeah, this is mine. I did this. This I could point to as it's because of me, internally, some spirit thing. I'm sorry. These people consider themselves atheists, but, like, their idea of, like, that there's the part of them that's supposed to be different than the conditions that brought them to every decision. I'm sorry, but if that's not the soul, what is it? It's not, there's no reckoning for it physically. It's literally just a fantasy of theirs. Meanwhile, we have these socially observable reality that all subjects are created by their surroundings. And so that means that political theories that are based on a libertarian theory of a subject are inherently fraudulent, and not only that, serve to be fucking, to enforce power. That's it.
But what it creates is people who can't imagine the world, because if you're part of a social fabric, right, then as awful as it might be to consider yourself dying, I hate thinking about dying. I do it all the time as a result of that. Like, if I didn't care about dying, I wouldn't think about it. But because I do, I think about it all the time. One of many reasons why the Buddhists are correct. But as unpleasant as it might imagine to like passing on, when you imagine that you're a part social being, you really can get some sort of comfort, not only a sense of responsibility for your actions and a sense of comfort in your position in like an eternal movement. You know, even if you don't have children yourself, you can imagine like the ripples you have, the ripple effect. You know, if you understand if you understand yourself as a social being, you understand your actions as having repercussions. And that is where, because you could say, oh, you are just the collection of your influences, yes. But then at some point there's that spark, you know, everyone's talked about it, Kierkegaard, the fucking, you know, it's the bootstrap thing. They brought consciousness into being, the mystery, the reason that God is still talked about, the reason that we have the language of the metaphysical. It's the 98% dark matter. It's the thing. It's that spark. We all have that. But then we have to operate in a matter context that is totally dependent by each other. But that means, and realizing that's where it comes in. Like, you might realize, oh, I'm the sum total of my actions. But because I'm the sum total of my actions, I'm the sum total of I'm the sum total of what's been reacted on me. That means that what has happened in my life, good and bad, is because other people did things. Which means that the things I do are going to have that same effect. And so that creates a sense of responsibility. It creates a morality. Like these idiot theists talk about how like you can't have morality without religion. I'm sorry, you absolutely can, but it requires a social understanding of the self, which is antithetical to basically every fucking mode of production that has been dominant in any civilization in the past 500 fucking years. As a result, where are you going to be able to contextualize those feelings? They end up getting turned into aberrant shit, or lied about, or dispersed. And what ends up happening is, because you can get no comfort in the idea that you are putting anything onto the world, because it's like, there is nothing but you. So it's like, oh, but others might, it's like, yeah, but that's not me. Like, the thing is, I feel this very acutely. And so I have a lot of empathy for the fucking boomers, because this feeling was, they were the first people in history to ever have this feeling. And then they had an answer shoved right in their face in the form of the commodified counterculture and the commodified capitalist self-expression that we're all slaves to. Even on the left, we're all slaves to that mindset. But they didn't really have a lot of options. It's hard to really blame them. I mean, blaming them, honestly, is not very materialist, frankly.
That's why, like, the root of technology is collaboration. No knowledge is siloed. I remember I actually read Atlas Shrugged. I read the whole thing. And I skimmed a lot of it, obviously, because it's so repetitive. But the way that Ayn Rand conceived of invention and technological progress was so insane. In her cosmology, every person who is like the inventor of a thing essentially deserves by inventing it all associated progress, and that they can like dole it out then in exchange for like market share or something. You could take the greatest genius in world history. You could take fucking Nikola Tesla or fucking any of the great innovators like Edison or something. If you dropped them on the top of a hill like a deformed Spartan child, none of them would invent shit. They would die of exposure. Maybe a few of them would be clever enough to create like a Quonset hut. But nothing is created without people collaborating across the space of unknown existence and comparing. Like nobody could invent anything because they're at the end of a process that began with the formation of the language they're thinking in and the numbers that they're using to write with. And every single element within the nested technologies that make up whatever the hell they're going to build on top of. And that's why libertarianism is just so laughable, and why the idea that there are people who consider themselves like geniuses, who take Rand seriously and objectivism seriously, it really does tell you that like there are different ways to be intelligent, and that we are defined by our ignorance. And one of the things that makes us that ends up making us most defined by our ignorance is by our refusal to admit that we aren't the full container of the world. We have to fill gaps. And one of the things that makes love possible is that when you love someone, one of the reasons you love them probably is because, not because they exactly mirror your mind, what your preferences, your experience, but because they have had different experiences and come to different conclusions that fill in the gaps for you, and then make it easier for both of you to navigate the world successfully, because you're getting more information and you're operating from a correct premise because you've collaborated. You complete me, literally, in the sense that you fill the hole of perception because of the non-overlapping experiences and sensitivities that we possess. If everybody had to act like a Randian hero, there would be no human existence. It would be a bunch of people with blindfolds on, swinging katanas at one another in a fucking room. How would that turn out? All right, I went over a little bit. So, yeah. No, just to end here, someone says, is American libertarianism the basis for neo-feudalism? Of course. Because it says it takes the liberal logic of the market to such an extent that, because feudalism replaced obligations, right, social obligations, with transactions, but transactions are assumed to be between equal parties, and all economic theory and all libertarian ethics are premised on equal exchange. But of course, exchange isn't equal because of the accumulated history of exploitation that makes up the human race and human existence. And so that accumulates social pressure, tension, and conflict. Ayn Rand's solution to the fact that there's so many people who are resent, even though it's like, isn't it irrational? Even though these titans of industry create the world for people, they're not happy with it and they whine about it. What's the answer to that? Her answer to that is they're dumb. And that what should happen is you just tell them about it until their stupid asses understand it. Well, guess what? That hasn't worked and can't work. What's going to happen is you're going to create a social order so fractured that the market will not be able to be sustained, because you won't be able to sustain social order. So you have to replace social order with coercive bilateral relationships. But this way, totally detached from a social order, a negative dialectic. But you want to know what neo-feudalism it is? It's going to be feudalism, but without the time off. Or the friends, or the family, or the religious awe, the peace, nothing. You'll be stimulus response. You'll be desire and fear turned into a node. They're going to prod you at one end with one or the other, and it's going to get behavior out of the other end. You're just going to be a neuron. And there will be no more social texture. That the liberal order presumes this market that we exchange in. No more money for that, no more time for that. That is replaced by bondage, by compulsion. But of course, not entirely compulsion, not just gun to the head. Like I said, pleasure too. Some boobs on the screen, some chicken congealed patties to consume. Perhaps Marvel film or two, if you're good. Whew. I do think they should nationalize passive income. Absolutely. Nationalize passive income. And also, this is one thing I agree with Bakunin about, abolish inheritance. And the beauty thing is you could actually do like a judo flip on libertarians. Of course, it won't matter because they don't really believe what they say they believe. But if you wanted to just win an argument with a libertarian, you could point out that all of the things they say about the market relationship, the equal relationship that exists between an employer and employee, how it's a fair negotiation between selling labor power and buying it. All of their perceptions only exist without concentrated wealth and debt more than anything determining the power structure within those negotiations. And the only way to prevent that is to mow the lawn. Every generation, every new group of people, you do not get your dad's fucking money or your mom's money. You don't get it. No debt and no wealth accumulated. You can accumulate, obviously, there's a difference between reform and abolishing capitalism, but if you even wanted to make capitalism even vaguely akin to its theoretical function, you would have to abolish those things. And the fact that that's absurd, the fact that those things that would actually make capitalism work are essentially not viable. Getting rid of passive income, yeah, that'll work. They're going to stop that. Getting rid of inheritance. The fact that those are non-negotiable means that capitalism has to be overthrown.
There's nothing that indicates an end stage power structure than it's controlled by actual incompetence. That is where the flaws the flaws that are sort of written into the code of something like monarchism or democracy or capitalist democracy or whatever, or Soviet communism, for example, or Chinese communism or whatever. The end stages of them all have in common that the leadership is genuinely decrepit. It has been rendered so by either literal inbreeding, like the old monarchs of Europe, or, in our case, a false meritocracy replicating itself, where you have this meritocratic class who engineer things so that just by coincidence, their next generation of meritocrats are, what's this? Their kids. What a coincidence. So they replicate essentially a literal blood aristocracy, but through this market mechanism and this justification that replaces the divine right of the old aristocracy, because nobody believes in God anymore. So you can't say it's mine by right of God. They say it's mine by right of justice, because we've inculcated Rawlsian justice as a social norm. Even though what they mean by justice, because they have these things that are technically available to all, and some people do rise up, but they replicate their own privilege, and their kids are, like the children of the most elite powerful everywhere, almost universally shitty, scummy pieces of fucking scum shit who don't understand anything about the world, who are psychotically self-obsessed, who are basically sociopaths, rendered so by their class position and their absolute distance from anything resembling real human life and suffering. And then they take over, and that is a byproduct of capitalism, specifically capitalism's democratic loss. How does capitalism deal with the fact that in order to maintain its legitimacy culturally, it has to have a democratic face, but also, if democracy was real, people could literally just vote themselves to communism, which was the theory of revisionist Marxism, and the Bernstein and Kautsky. And it looked like it was working. And then a bunch of things were invented by the very, very capable and improvisatory capitalism. One being fascism, of course, a way to replicate mass politics on the right, and also circumscribing politics. And one way to circumscribe politics is to make it elite. And you make it elite by putting barriers up that are related to social standing that is hypothetically neutral, but in reality replicates a class privilege. It's a secular sanitation of aristocracy. That's what the meritocracy is. And so these people are just as much clueless dullards as the court of Louis Couture, or the Mad King George, or any of them.
Yes. social enlightenment comes to the middle and upper classes before it comes to the working class, because you have to have a certain level of comfort in order to accommodate others, or else you're in tunnel vision, gotta get mine mode, which is what these people have, even though they already have everything. But that's the thing. You're a hungry ghost. You have no perspective. That means that even as you are always satiated, any displeasure becomes as bad to your brain. Any displeasure, like a pea, like the pea in the princess's mattresses, that becomes as searing as the hunger pains of someone who has had to skip the last 3 meals because their fucking COVID payment is late, or because they live in a fucking favela in Brazil or something. To them, it's as real because they feel nothing but pleasure. Any pain, any discomfort is everything. If you don't have that, the horror of obliteration there, the consciousness of the obliteration of your ego, which you are worshiping without knowing it. You're secretly worshiping your own ego, but it will annihilate. It will be annihilated. It can't be reconciled unless the ego can be turned outward, essentially, and externalized into social connections with others. And if that happened, people don't have to be told not to kill each other. People don't have to be told not to exploit one another for profit. It would occur to them to do it. Now, of course, that's not going to be true of everyone at once, and that's why utopianism is a bad way to organize your politics, because it is so far from us. But we have to have some vision of what this is for, I believe. And I believe this is not, and I believe that what sounds goofy about it and what sounds pie in the sky about it only feels that way if you're imagining it as being totalizing and instantaneous. But if you imagine it as a process being moved towards, and then at one point you get a critical mass of people, and the social mechanism that generates evil is overcome over time, and fewer people are operating under those constraints, that social dysfunction will also be leached out of society and out of our human nature. Our human nature will now be something completely different than what we think it is. But it's only because we've resolved all the contradictions of producing for use and surplus on a planet of resources. And so that over time, that becomes, there's a tipping point is reached where that, because the thing is, there's that in society at all times. It's just right now being crushed. It's being destroyed. It's being obliterated by capitalism. But of course, capitalism is acquiring elements of it. Like the wokeification of capitalism is a dialectical process. Like the base of neoliberalism is actually being changed the way, because the base, this has to be remembered, and I don't think I emphasize this enough, is that the base generates the superstructure, but then the superstructure changes the base. But the reason that distinction matters is because you can never change the operation at the superstructural level because it's not generative. Once the process begins, though, it's reinforcing. And so the woke stuff that looks like, to a lot of people who are just kind of reactionary socially and they want a reason for it to be socially acceptable, they see that and they're like, oh, this is socialism being, commodified. It's like, well, yeah, that's the motive, but it's also at a social level, it is capitalism being humanized a little. But of course, over time, it shrinks and grows according to how much money we have, how much wealth we have, how much ability we have to spread pain around. Like, we had the civil rights movement during the height of America's prosperity for a reason, because expectations were heightened, and just as importantly, among the white people, there was enough prosperity for most of them to go, you know what, let them have it. That wasn't an accident. Those two things drove each other. Now we're in a situation where standards of living are declining, where people are feeling more and more, even if they are not materially deprived, they sense the impending deprivation of their material circumstances. Like they say that the white bourgeois most likely to vote for Trump were white bourgeois in places that had high levels of unemployment, poverty, and opiate overdose. As in, they were the rich people, but the rich people in the poor towns. As in, they saw what could happen to white people. Something they thought could only happen to the lazy and the black could happen to white people, which means it could happen to them.
And there's a remarkable correspondence between Secretary of State Lansing and President Woodrow Wilson, in which Lansing says, the Bolsheviks are wanting in political virtue. They would preach to the ordinary man that he might elevate himself through political means rather than by dint of hard work. This would be a most unfortunate example to the common man in our country and other countries. They understood what was the threat.
People don't think that they can change anything with politics. Anything structural. If it's structural, it is by definition not political. That is what we believe, because that's what we believe. And why do we believe it? Because it's what we live. It is just our lived experience, ironically enough. Our collective lived experience is capitalist realism. It is that because we stopped having a class adversarial relationship at the top level of government in the 70s, and that the democratic project has basically been dead since then. And that as a result of that, the two parties don't argue about things like how long should people work? What should be the conditions of their work? What should be remuneration? What should be the standard of living for an American? Those questions are not political to people, even if we talk about them sometimes high-mindedly. And what that means is that at this point, I feel like if you get in front of a bunch of people, casuals, who are going to just come into the polls because it's so easy now, they're going to hear you say, I want to get Medicare for all, and I want to make everybody have free college. Just like Corbyn did, because Corbyn got to run a general election where he got to make his message spread in a country where they have a fucking parliamentary system where if he got in power, he could actually have done some stuff because they don't have our stupid fucking constitution. It's a majority rule. And yet, in the red redoubt there, the red wall, they went for Brexit because Brexit was more real to them than the stuff Corbyn was promising, because they didn't think he was telling them the truth. And even though some people are going to be disarmed by the genuineness of a guy like Corbyn and Bernie, and that's going to get you some people, it's not going to get you enough people. And a lot of people are going to see it and they're going to be like, yeah. And then they're going to go back to the big questions, which are cultural and identity-based.
There's a real powerful point there where he says work will never be as noble as play. And what that really gets at is the notion of human labor and activity put to one's own end or to the ends of an employer. Like alienated labor and free existence. Like that is like one of those like end stage Marxist concepts that you don't hear a lot of talk about because it's very speculative and metaphysical almost. But there really is a notion in Marxism that once you have removed the need to exploit labor away from one's own ends to maintain life, like through the socialization of the means of production and the sharing of the surplus result of that, that anything you do is not like anything you've ever done. It's not like anything we do, because everything we do is induced by coercion. And that induced coercion poisons every action we take and alienates us from them and slowly poisons us against them. And then Marx, the end state of Marxism is one in which that is replaced by pure action, devoid of coercion, purely self-expression. And the closest thing we do have in life to that is play, is games, where we are doing it of our own free will. And within the game's rules, we are able to thrive and do what we want and do something to try to achieve victory. Like that is really the goal. The goal of communism is to make that the rule rather than the very, very rare exception to human life.
So there you go. Drop some theory on you guys. Boom. Didn't mean to do that. Didn't mean to drop theory on you guys. I should have said more about that with the debate with Virgil, honestly. Because gaming culture really does poison something that really should be powerful. Like the idea of play and games as like the end state, the most noble state. And you can argue that a lot of these elite gamers have achieved something similar to that. In that they are gaming with their time. And they're not induced to do so because they live off their parents. But it's a cruel parody of it because it's bound up in exploitation and it makes it impossible to game, basically. This simulacra of gaming, this cruel mockery of gaming, gives us only a taunting wisp of what could be gaming, and only instead reifies exploitation within the industry and the creation of the commodity form. Gaming is commodity. So there you go. Boom. Theory. Putting up some theory time. I don't know if Kim Jong-un is dead. I don't have his phone number. I can't get him on the beeper. I don't know why you think I would have that information, but that's flattering, I guess, to think that you believe me to have connections in the North Korean inner circles. I do not. I am a mere fellow traveler with the Juche ideal. And honestly, I feel like everybody should get on the good side of Juche because I kind of feel like it might be the dominant ideology in the human history. That like, if humans exist to like propagate through the galaxy and become like a Dune-like empire of systems and trillions of people, it'll be under an underlying Juche ideology. Because as far as I could see, and this was true before the fucking virus came, that North Korea was well situated to survive more well intact than other social political polities in the occasion of a genuine crisis caused by global warming. Like, it's up there, it's in the north, it's not going to get too hot all of a sudden. It's going to be able to sustain a local ecology. And they're also going to have more social cohesion than most of the surrounding places. So what if, and they have relatively defensible borders? What if they hold out and create and become like the only coherent body politic in like the post-collapse world when everything else is, reverted to the fucking Peloponnese before the rise of the city-states, like prehistory. Juche will have an advantage. And the flag of Juche will ride over the world and re-found civilization along Juche ideals. And then it is Juche that harnesses the atom to its full power and carpets the galaxies in a human panspermia, all with the idea that the Kims are a divine, like God Emperor type thing. Like by the time it gets to space, it would essentially be like Dune or Warhammer, where the God Emperor would be the Kims. Like the lizard, the fucking the sand snake or the sandworm headed God Emperor is the Kim, like passed down through all, like the consciousness passed from every generation, starting with Kim Jong-un or Kim Il-sung. So that'd be cool. What if that happens? That'd be funny. So get on the right side of Juche, folks. It might end up being the winner in the history books.
Chomsky, God bless him, is a liberal, and he says he is, which is why I don't understand anarchists who get mad when you point that out. Anarchism is liberalism. It is a higher stage of liberalism. Anarchism is like the highest stage you can get of liberalism towards justice before it breaks down due to its internal contradictions. So it is more advanced than liberalism. It is a form of liberalism. That's the thing, is that these categories are all gradients of one another. They are not binary categories. They are, but then that dissolves over time. So, like, through the accumulation of practice, anarchism is a superior and more progressive form of liberalism, but it comes from liberalism. And because liberalism is now just a slur and a slander that you throw on people you don't like on Twitter to show that you're to the left, Like, why does everyone call everybody liberal? Because then they're not part of the left, and that means you are. And people should pay attention to you because you're not a liberal, because everyone understands that a liberal is out of the club. So instead of, because like anarchists get that excited, like, oh, am I a liberal? And maybe they'll find, you know what, I actually am a liberal. And then they're good. I am a liberal anarchist. But they insist on saying, no, I'm a fucking socialist. And it just confuses everything. Because they have to be on the left. They have to be liberal, socialists, to be good. Because the reason all these political opinions matter so much to us is because of how little we use them. Because how much they are just in our heads. If we lived them every day, they would be secure, and we wouldn't have to reify them by having them reinforced by going on Twitter and having people tell us that we're good socialists. If we lived as good socialists, we wouldn't need to be told.
I honestly think that it could have really, of a genre, you, like what, because,